Welcome to Original Nature, Part 2. In this section, we'll be looking at some extensions of the concept of original nature as it applies itself to social, cultural, ecological, and political realities. The presentation runs through the true self in relationship to three major purposes of life. Systems theory is viewed as an ecological proposal. Included is various systems theories which are posited as a philosophy of organism. Systems theory as political theory will likewise be explored. Finally, we'll look briefly at two existentialists. Logos, heart, and love, a being of Logos, has been explained previously as the concept of the true self and the general creative function where heart and concern for all becomes a predominant factor throughout. In the era of the Greeks, Logos was described as cosmology, Platonic ideas, and nous, which told us mind found everything in the cosmos to be intelligible. Heart was theoretically less evident, but ethics was foremost in the Greek mind. Logos could therefore be extrapolated into three purposes. 1. Logos was presented as a general creative agency giving rise to the Big Bang and the processive cosmos. The universe and all life in it was viewed as one interconnected body and process. And regarding the emergent self, we see it developing through stages and moving towards a mature and ethical stance towards life and nature. From infancy, this self unfolds from a relational matrix, suggesting interrelatedness is a natural and optimal way of being. Paradoxically, self cannot be wholly defined in isolation, and where currently neuroscience, moreover, now confirms clear stages of development in current attachment theories. 2. From the general characteristics and relational properties of the creative universe, marriage becomes our second proposal. We are relational and emotional beings from the start, and for most, this idea boils down to the completion of the self by another in the mature periods. With individuation, C.G. Jung spoke of a further three stages of marriage in his Marriage as a Psychological Relationship, whereas Barbara Markey, in her life cycle stages of marriage, refers to 8 stages, including developmental tasks. Whatever the case, family is viewed as a miniaturation of orderly systems in process, such as those found elsewhere in the cosmos. 3. Again, Logos, as a systems theory, including complexity or synchronicity, becomes an interactive world of relatedness. It is defined by consciousness and purposiveness throughout, and we can also say this is simply deep ecology. Networks of connectivity all the way down. Therefore, it might save us best to promote the all-important sustainability in systems we actually depend upon. Creativity is the ability to create based on heart, though not ignoring skills, as we saw in the first section concerning Logos. This is a two-stage structure of creativity based on a system of dual characteristics which is called the quadruple base. This is illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide. The Logos structure moves from ideas and concepts in the first stage to a pre-production pre-energy state in the second stage, just before work begins. Synthesis here incorporates the meaning of managing, processing, preserving, but not exploiting, nor would it support any type of conflict. Hence, various kinds of activities involving matter such as primary, secondary, and tertiary industries, as well as the activities to govern society, including politics, art, and science, fall under the activities of having dominion over creation. In doing so, harmony, balance, and elements of beauty would be found in all activities, whereas the similar Hegelian dialectic, using the term antithesis, remains questionable. Science has been an attempt at coming to terms with the whole of reality. From a unification thought perspective, evolution, for example, is accepted as phenomenology. Yet science is being transformed today by insights regarding the Higgs boson, theory of entanglement, and from various consciousness studies. Einstein suggested the transcendent domain and the immanent domain could not function well without one another. Religion without science is blind. Science without religion is lame, he said. There is transcendence and there is immanence. Unification thought epistemology regarding human consciousness also brings up the question of proto-consciousness. This suggests mind participates with a transcendent form of field consciousness, where studies concerning a quantum relationship with neurons is favored. Jean-Emile Charron, mentioned in the text, posited complex relativity. His field, suggesting a type of conscious universe with mental-like properties belonging to all particles, for example. John Eccles proposed a similar quantum-to-neuron interaction in 1993, and Roger Penrose, a mathematical physicist working with another quantum-to-neuron theory, said after trying to solve this problem that quantum theories were insufficient in solving this problem. He suggested a new paradigm where quantum and classical science in synthesis might do better, as perhaps the synthesis of Sungsang and Hyungsang in Logos might suggest. The arts, culture, and community are proposed as our future rather than religion. Religion is an artificial construct predicated to pathologies, yet focused to healing. So beyond that, we can say nature, natural law, culture, creativity, festival, and community are the essential building blocks of our new world, should we make that choice. Already we have remarkable works of art in the field of art, music, sculpture, multimedia, and architecture. Hegel suggested the tradition of realism in art was completed by 1864. It developed in 3 stages to completion, and he called this accomplishment his end of art. However, art did not simply grind to a halt, but was transformed by another advance into novelty, including multimedia developments. Arthur Danto opined of this that art continued in such various forms, yet he also noted that modernity had lost its sense of the aesthetics, surrendering to calophobia, as he called it, a fear of the beautiful, and an affair with the ugly and the empty. During the Renaissance, Marsilio Ficino already suggested beauty. Eros, extracted from Plato's Symposium, led us euphorically to a Gestalt experience, then to transcendent unity. Beauty here lured us towards a transcendent function. Beautiful forms, the Hyungsang or mass function of the Logos theory, draws us inward and deeper to eidos, to ideas, and to further transcendent virtues. Therefore, we might ask what is sustainable in the arts and culture. We have great insights into the creative function, but we see dysfunctions woven through its practical applications, and many face a decline, similar to what great civilizations in the past have suffered. At the UN, a critical era of conscience was proclaimed recently, with a focus on future development. In this time of turbulence and uneasiness, the notion of the true self, the conscience, and virtues of the heart hold out great hope for a world defined by such an ethical stance. Archetypal systems offer patterns and dynamics woven into complexity theories and the idea of an interconnected universe, a web of life to which we are inextricably bound in many levels. Arne Naess and his Eco-Sophy sets self-realization, original nature at its core, and therefore proposes a concern for all living things, understood in the fullness of life, running all the way down. Moreover, communication came under the microscope. Ecology suggests interactivity functioning throughout this relational field and defining systems thinking. Gregory Bateson, in his Steps to an Ecology of Mind, warned our survival depends upon radical transformation of the dominant patterns of thinking in the West. These patterns, often based on materialism or economic priorities, are widely shared, passed along in everyday conversation, and encoded into culture as a self-defeating philosophy. The institutions that give special legitimacy to these patterns of thinking are the media, public schools, and the universities. Bateson saw the world as a series of systems containing those of individuals, societies, and ecosystems. Each of these systems has adaptive changes which depend upon feedback loops to control balance by changing multiple variables. Feedback loops are apparent in climate change, where problematic issues have already risen to the surface, encouraging us to seek a more sustainable set of answers. Bateson also viewed that all three systems of the individual, society, and ecosystem belong to one supreme system that controls everything. This supreme system, a meta-dialogue, lies beyond the individual and could be equated to what he may have thought of as God, though Bateson mostly referred to it as mind. General ecological proposals already tell us that our relationship to others and our planet are vital and requires a healthful and respectful approach regarding communication, and where synchronicity, moreover, reveals acausal networks, which offer us another layer of communication on a subliminal level. Relationships are mostly defined in a hierarchical way in both East and West. Such systems thinking suggests a certain order is established in any system if it is to be coherent and sustainable. Therefore, an object position defines those who are related to a subject figure found in any systems group. Caution tells us that it's not enough to say order or some kind of structural proposal is the first principle, because heart must be given priority in all circumstances. This is the question concerning whether a system is defined mechanically, biologically, or by concerned consciousness applied throughout. Parents are clearly subject in the family, but the quality of love tells us what kind of parents they are and how their children, who stand in an object position, might respond to their family values. Love and emotional intelligence tend to be sustainable, but authoritarianism often promotes rebellion. Logos theory tells us all first started in an object position to the Creator. Yet parents, presidents, teachers, and CEOs, if authentic, also come to echo this first proposal. Whether by innate qualities or by cultivation, they become subject figures, drawing object partners into their sphere of influence. As an individual is an integral part of such a group, we find, for example, the infant begins life socially like this, with the mother as the object of her love. This social concern, best learned here, follows us through life as a template does, taking us to the vital qualities of later networks, where good communication tends to define sustainability. Confucian filial piety, a similar proposal, is paralleled in the West by the maxim, honor thy mother and father. But for Confucius, filial piety was not merely blind loyalty to one's parents. More important than the norms of respect were the norms of ren, benevolence, and yi, righteousness. Ren, an innate human quality, and yi, then became necessary character traits looking to be cultivated further. Ren can take on political dimensions too. Confucianism says that if the ruler lacks ren, it will be difficult for his subjects to behave humanely. The ruler is exhorted to refrain from acting inhumanely towards his subjects, Therefore, an inhumane ruler runs the risk of losing the mandate of heaven, the right to rule. The abuse of this universal dynamic of object consciousness can be seen in the breakdown of respect in all areas of contemporary culture, which brings with it a certain fragmentation to the field. Moreover, when figures like Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Nicolae Ceausescu, for example, play on this principle, turning it towards their own pathological ends, and by deception, they draw people into a false sense of order, into stagnation, and worse. Unfortunately, people are often deceived by such false subjects. These kind of failures, including inauthenticity found in families, schools, businesses, and so forth, incur deep suspicion as we see today, and perhaps explain the disenchantment with the political world as we speak. Old systems, likewise, can falter and are overtaken by new models which hold to a more full and authentic expression of these principles. The subject position refers to the term leader or best skilled in any given circumstance, but a certain mental and emotional posture is also required to honor that position. Much of this emerges from natural growth, but it is a vitally important factor in supporting the establishment of an ethical and cohesive society. Subject consciousness, or heart, asks of anyone in such a position to hold to a profound concern for the core values of a mission, including unchanging transcendent virtues, this being called a vertical concern. It also has to be referred to all those he or she is in conversation with as found in a horizontal concern to the relational field of humanity. Likewise, it can be a fluid proposition in certain circumstances, but there are three things to consider. 1. In any group or alliance or social structure, a subject figure must demonstrate sincere concern for all. A failure here leads to distrust and worse, forming within the group. 2. Subject consciousness is a two-way street. There is vertical and transcendent concerns which must be upheld at all times, and there is concern for the other side. This is authenticity. In concern for others, do we understand the person's deepest nature, talents, hopes, dreams, even insecurities? And do we extend ourselves to those with compassion and effective helping strategies? Are we qualified to uphold the values and harmony which promote creativity and joy? Because life without joy becomes a grim task. 3. Proper authority, solving skills, and emotional intelligence are predicated to order. Love and order work in tandem. Principles like these have to be established by the subject and come to define success or failure. Finally, any excessive consciousness of authority tends to move to relentless control, and such intimidation inhibits free expression and creativity, which is essential for the success of the whole. A materialistic or capitalistic environment, including the exploitative, hoarding, and marketing mode, which Erich Fromm speaks of, cannot stand as such a model. Indeed, materialism often leads to industrial stagnation because the main orientation does not embrace the subject-order harmony of which we speak. It has a different purpose, nor does it honor the creation, which tends to be exploited under this rubric rather than being tended with consideration. The math of the universe, located in the Hyungsang side of Logos, giving us math, geometry, and plans, in this case, blueprints for creation, offers us divine proportion. Pythagoras talks of the harmony of the spheres, a mathematical model of the universe, and Euclid in Book 8 thereafter brought us the golden mean. Math and geometries went on to describe Johannes Kepler's theological proposal and further work on planetary motion, which later came to support quantum numbers and archetypal theory. In the quasi-crystal structures examined by Roger Penrose, we find similar proposals, traceable in many ways back to Euclid and the Platonic solids. Still, Euclidean math was used by Marco Vitruvius, a Roman architect, who wrote of divine proportion in his De Architectura. This work was later translated by the monk Pacioli and presented to Leonardo da Vinci during his Milan period. Leonardo's Vitruvian Man emerged from this, and divine proportion went on to become a major concern for the Renaissance arts. Divine proportion and harmony then informed painting, music, poetry, architecture, and sculpture in Florence, thereby promoting the idea of excellence in the High Renaissance. Math and geometry became an architectural providence seeking to create calm spiritual supportive space with geometric forms. Math also translated to iambic pentameter in poetry, rhythm in music, and in proportion, balance, harmony, and the perspective model found in the visual arts. Thus, ideas were firmly and eloquently placed on the ground. The Platonic solids found in Timaeus embrace the classical elements of earth, air, water, fire, and the dodecahedron, which offered Plato his 5 solids, of which he said, "The god used this for arranging the constellations of the whole heaven." Such ideas embracing math and geometries are taken later to spin, geometry and motion, and the quantum number of matter by contemporary thinkers. Math, however, offers another type of systems thinking, morphology. These are clear plant structures exhibiting organized forms which are transformed later into social theory by some thinkers. In the case of cell biology, an interactive universe of cells offered porosity and communication with one another. When Goethe earlier looked at the morphology of plants and interactivity in his time, he saw an underlying structure, his Urphänomen, his deep ground, and his Urpflanze, his plant patterns, all of which was predicated to a deeper ground. When this archetypal idea was shifted to an examination of social systems, the term autopoietic was added to the portfolio, offering us ideas of sustainable biological constructs viewed as living systems. With these healthy principles, such systems came to offer a model of sustainable social constructs which mimic biology. First proposed by the Chilean scientists Humberto Maturana and Francesco Varela in the early 70s, these ideas supported the concepts of homeostasis, the optimal and dynamic functioning of systems, which were picked up as ideas adaptable to social constructs. Niklas Luhmann, a sociologist, advocated here a grand theory to his type of framework, a meta-narrative as it is often invoked, although Luhmann's work tracks closer to complexity theory. Luhmann offers a system and social theory, a communication theory, and an evolution theory, where a social system then becomes a sustainable, communicative model. The core element arguably becomes a communication theory, as social theory and communication cannot be separated. Jürgen Habermas likewise covered communication within systems very well, but does not discuss any kind of meta-narrative, nor does he in his Aesthetics, where he remains close to dialectic and Marxist philosophy. Yet his work on communication cannot be ignored. So by and large, we are left with a social contract and a philosophy of organism emerging from nature. There are a number of ways to view systems theory. Logos forms a cosmology, self, and a socio-political paradigm. Complex theories tell us that many parts relate to the whole. Process theology is a theory of complexity emerging from the one. Holons and holarchies tell us a holon is both part and whole of the entire system. Paleopsychology illustrates systems are traceable from quantum levels to family. Idea or archetypes, patterns, and dynamics become evident in many domains, including behavioral patterns and language, for example. Nous or mind, including the traditional philosophic ladder of ascent, reveals creation proceeds downwards to human complexities, and where the divine mind of human consciousness can likewise proceed upwards back to transcendent singularity and a non-dual state, offering a transcendent to immanent function synthesized. However, from A.N. Whitehead's religious philosophy and Brian Henning's Whiteheadian ethics, we extract concerned consciousness and read that during the process of creation, each occasion is an activity of concern. It is the conjunction of transcendence and immanence. Thus, we read the occasion, although engaged in its own immediate self-realization, is also concerned with the entire universe. It is an immensely moral proposition, and this is deep ecology at its best. Ideas, archetypes, patterns, and dynamics inform life events and socio-political realities, which become visible as patterns, dynamics, structural realities, and behaviors. In Greek times, such ideas were dimly perceived, as Plato informs us, yet these ideas came to inform much of Greek civilization. At this time, the psyche was examined, offering a tripartite and topographical mind of emotion, intellect, and will, which opened to our basic virtues in the search for beauty, truth, and goodness, an optimum function of mind, or nous, as they called it, where mind becomes an intelligible function, well suited to cooperating with natural law. Moreover, it was within these fields that such a self was placed into the new city polis. These ethical stances, including human sociability, offered satisfaction and happiness, the Greek eudaimonia. It was this kind of person and a systems like teleology which populated the new democratic landscape. The cultivation of an ethical stance to life became rich in terms of personal success, in the area of internal rewards, and in the prosperous functioning of the state. In the year 507 BC, the Athenian leader Cleisthenes introduced a system of political reforms which he called democratia, or the rule by people. This system was composed of three separate institutions: the ecclesia, a sovereign governed body that wrote laws and dictated foreign policy; the bull, a council of representatives from the 10 Athenian tribes; and the dicasteria, the popular courts in which citizens argued cases before a group of lottery-selected jurors. Although this Athenian democracy would survive for only 2 centuries, Cleisthenes' invention was one of ancient Greece's most enduring contributions to the modern Western world. Athenian democracy, essentially a reduction of power by the nobility where voting and assembly took place, introduced a new agreement and power sharing. Philosophy and justice was explored in Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics and Ethics, all of which did much to supply us with the stuff of democracy. Psychology, ethics, politics, and organized systems where all these interdependent functions nested into one another. Much of this thinking developed from the Logos of Heraclitus, appropriately viewed as an overarching philosophy of organism, an idea, a systems theory, or simply put, as natural law. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke attended the same school rooted in the old scholastic tradition. Both were disenchanted, and both came out with very different conclusions. During a period of conflict, Hobbes seems to have held to natural law, yet enforced by a powerful central authority, whereas Locke suggested natural law was not something given or enforced by any state. It was a law determined by nature, his religious beliefs, and therefore a universal proposition open to all. His philosophy of mind opened to natural justice, an idea originally attributed to the Stoics, which was by design a divine or eternal law extant in nature, the cosmos, and within the self. In this he was pursuing the idea of a connected being, consciously networked into the fabric of cosmos and society. Locke developed his political theory in an unstable period running through Oliver Cromwell to Charles II to William of Orange. In this period of civil wars and revolution, roughly from 1640 to 1688, Locke was exiled in Holland for a time, worked on the colonial Carolinas Constitution, then wrote his essay concerning human understanding, a philosophy of mind, mostly empirical in nature. The two treatises of government emerged by 1688 and tackled the patriarchal mandate of the divine right of kings. Locke posited absolute monarchy has no legitimacy. Likewise, he said, government cannot be a product of force and violence. He then replaces this with what was common to 18th century political philosophy, natural rights and the social contract. From Locke, we read the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Legitimate government is instituted by the explicit consent of those governed, that is to say, a people and a democracy, which are derived from the social contract. The establishment of this government is a two-step process. First, universal consent is necessary to form a political community. Here, consent to join a community, once given, is binding and cannot be withdrawn. This makes political communities stable. Then who rules? The answer to this question is determined by majority rule, and majority consent reveals who is to rule such a community. Universal consent and majority consent are thus different in kind, not just in degree. Locke's argument for the right of the majority is the theoretical ground for the distinction between duty to society and duty to government, the distinction that permits an argument for resistance without anarchy. When the designated government dissolves, for example, men still remain obligated to society, acting through majority rule. Locke likewise supported religious freedom in an age of Protestant turmoil and was himself likely an Anglican. No one can claim theological correctness, he said. Only God can determine that. Therefore, Locke posits skepticism about religious knowledge, yet we find a strong argument for religious toleration. Republican America established their political contract as one nation under God, but realized quite quickly that the political landscape was not inhabited by the true self, nor defined by the original mind. Therefore, in their holarchical version of a governmental system, checks, balances, and transparencies were established within their system because the nature of humankind was unpredictable. History had revealed to them a cautionary tale. Can we see further stages of development beyond that? If original nature can be confirmed, along with its enduring and personal ethical proclivities, government can remain as an autopoietic system, but any form of controls and administrative bodies can be minimized as conscience takes up central defining proclivities of the self. This shift to what might be called a freedom society, where men and women of good conscience, self-regulated and fully sustainable, suggests little control is needed. It becomes a less is more proposition. And in all of this, there is a striving for the connected being and concerned consciousness, vital for a new homogeneous society and world. That kind of revolution requires introspection and changes made first at the individual level. In summary, an original human being embraces internal Sungsang and external Hyungsang qualities. Internally, a conscious to intuitive function, or beyond that, mind to body relationship. 2. The harmony of man and woman mirrors similar universal principles. One can say here, yin and yang complete one another. 3. A divine character in Logos is an ethical stance to life. 4. Creativity and virtues define original nature and the original mind. 5. The functionality of systems offer positions and hierarchies, not as severe structures, as it were, but as belongingness. Logos predicated to the original nature assumes the proposition that in fact ecology, social systems, democracy, the freedom society, and the original self all belong to one matrix or a constellation, all being interactive agencies by nature. Existentialism can be said to represent a search for original human nature, but time limits us to the discussion of two. Kierkegaard, our first, held to a concept of the true self, defining it as spirit. The self is relational, yet he came to view this self as being separated from God. He saw a form of dualism where despair and dread crept into the human landscape. Moreover, he worried about how people dealt with this reality. He asserted that in order for people to actualize their true human nature, they could not simply live by sensual desires alone. The philosopher next saw these three stages by which people could be returned to their original value. The aesthetic existence was first defined as appetitive desires for the most part, whereby humankind lies trapped. The ethical existence, a second proposal, stated conscience comes into play, but only takes one to a sense of responsibility, which is hard to sustain. The third proposal, religious existence, says faith brings one before God and to internal transformation. Yet, some of this faith is paradoxical. Kierkegaard notes Abraham offering his son Isaac as a sacrifice leaves us with a profound dilemma. Still, loving your neighbor as yourself is a powerful maxim whereby a true society might be established. Frequently, Kierkegaard is tied philosophically to Hegel, but in these three stages we see a similarity to Friedrich Schiller's aesthetic letters, where beauty and play, aesthetics, then lure one through education to higher ground. These philosophers are all asking, can true self and a true society actually be realized? In an appraisal, Kierkegaard has touched upon a problem whereby appetitive desires separate one from God, but he does not clearly state this problem, framed up as a mind and body problem. Dualism, where bodily needs override the mind. Likewise, he sees the self not as absolute, rather as a being of individuality, a self-referral proposition with unclear proclivities. In this sense, there is no real mention of Shimjung or heart or a clear connectivity to the absolute ground of being to which the original or true self and its ethical stance are predicated. The true self would prioritize mind and spirituality, but accept necessary bodily needs. There is a sense of a solitary and incomplete self here. Kierkegaard suggests good citizens live with a sense of responsibility and duty, as Kant did. But in reality, no matter how one tries, it's impossible to legislate all this in accordance with conscience, unless a clear internal transformation takes place. He is saying this separation from the root takes place in freedom and by the introduction of dread when God's word is violated. Then we face existential anxiety. If this gulf remains, the dream remains unconfirmed. But there is no clear picture of God or his attributes, and no clear reason why this separation has come about, and no clear path back to wholeness. In failing to marry as he did when 24, worried about drawing his intended Regina Olsen into unhappiness, he is left existentially alone, standing without a partner to bring him to completion. This failure of relationship is similar to failures in other areas of his thinking, mind and body, self and totally other, where the general synthesis of dual characteristics is weakly proposed. Kierkegaard nevertheless came close to unification thinking in terms of his direction moving towards authenticity of the self, to true love lying between couples, and to bringing transcendent virtues into the immanent world in a concrete way, this being some of unification thought's purposes. Although there is vagueness on unresolved issues, his exhortation for self-examination, his appeal to the religious to become authentic persons of faith, and his efforts in challenging the status quo can be deeply appreciated. Nietzsche, our second philosopher, attributed Christianity with a slave mentality, whereby human potential was lost when being projected into an unreal domain of belief, rather than being lived. He therefore said that the human being was deprived of their vitality by Christianity, rejected the theology, and stated, furthermore, God is dead. He is often described as a forerunner to Freudian thinking, which defines religion as neurosis, the self as self-contained, instinctually driven, and libidinous. In place of religion, he promoted the notion of the Superman, his Übermensch, a master morality which proclaimed will and power as being central to unleashing full human potential. In his thoughts, he rejected the life of love and spirituality. Moreover, he thought Christianity affirmed only life in the next world, whereas Nietzsche placed it in the here and now firmly within a humanist and materialistic framework. He argued that behind every human action there exists a will to power, his Wille zur Macht, a will which seeks to increase the individual's strength. In his words, "Where I found the living, there I found the will to power. And even in the will of those who serve, I found the will to be master." However, there was little meaning beyond that other than the idea of eternal recurrence, where he said, everything goes, everything comes back, eternally rolls the wheel of being. He therefore preached the love of fate and the idea that anything goes. This idea that the world repeats itself forever without any purpose or meaning led him to confirm a Dionysian lifestyle as his version of teleology. Fate as a deterministic proposition led to his master morality, his ethics reduced to a standard of good and evil. Here he states everything that heightens the feeling of power in man is good, and everything that can be ascribed to weakness and failure is bad. What is worse than addiction, he said, is pity for the failure and the weak. Therefore, the Christian ethic of compassion would presumably be evil. In this appraisal, whilst one could argue points over what Christianity is or is not, Nietzsche's criticism of the afterlife and the failure to achieve the fullness of life was a timely warning to Christianity, where self, transcendence, and worldly realities were often ill-considered and defined separately. Yet by analysis, he was not referring to what Jesus taught. Rather, Pauline Christianity, which transformed the thinking of Jesus into this emphasis on life after death. Likewise, Neoplatonic philosophy strengthened this ethereal proposition over the notion that Christ actually came to build the kingdom of heaven on earth. In this sense, the criticism of otherworldly theologies is justifiable, but a general deletion of Christianity and the death of God proposition was a misjudgment. Furthermore, at the time of Nietzsche, there was a general movement to relocate external belief into the interior of man, running from the German idealist to the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, thus beginning to ascertain some of the realities of what original nature might come to mean. From the perspective of unification thought, God is therefore not remote. Rather, the task at hand is to bring transcendent ideals down to earth in imminent and concrete ways throughout one's life. By stressing only the will to power, Nietzsche's misunderstanding here replaces concerned consciousness with determinism and becomes vulnerable to supporting forms of tyranny. Likewise, the emphasis on appetite of desires, instinct, and life drives obfuscates the human spirit and the purpose of life, which we have already covered. Certainly, the notion of the Übermensch is worthy of much more consideration, as it lies close to the concept of the true self. But the core value of unification thought proposals is the more nuanced sense of heart and the relational field, and where destiny is something formed by free will, choice, participation, and creative advances into the future. Ultimately, Nietzsche promoted a type of instinctual life supported by bacchanalian revelry. The general thrust of his thinking emphasizes only what we call the Jungsang aspect, the external, the physical, and the materialistic, actually encouraging people to be more animalistic rather than including the internal strengths and wisdoms required for real spirituality. Nevertheless, his critique of Christianity and the failure of the self to actualize its divine nature is something which cannot be ignored in the face of persistent failures in the religious domain. This graphic is a summary of the theory presented in terms of environments. The environments of which we speak is defined as unity in the structure. This offers an interactive agency and hierarchies common to systems thinking and describes variously as archetypes, holarchies, autopoietic systems, and complexity, a synthetic and holistic nature. They are simply areas of interaction. From Logos, we likewise find nature, self, and culture as emergent properties, which, if defined by Xinjiang, our world of heart, functions like constellations with creative sustainability. This brings us to the end of this presentation, which I hope you've enjoyed. For more information, you can contact the Unification Thought Institute or use the email on this page. I thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated. We'll see you soon.